A few years back, a guy I know who worked the front desk at a hotel in Columbus, Ohio, opened his investment app after 11 months of consistent contributions. He had not missed a single deposit. His balance had grown by a little over $4,000. He stared at it for a long moment, then closed the app and did not open it again for 6 weeks. Most people who hear that story assume he lacked discipline. He did not. He was doing everything correctly. The problem was that the scoreboard he was watching gave him no useful information about where he actually stood. Here is the gap. Compounding is almost universally described as a force that rewards patience. What nobody explains is that in the early years, it is nearly invisible. The account does not look like it is working. It looks like it is broken. And that feeling is not a personal failure. It is a structural feature of how compounding actually behaves over time. So why does the math feel so dishonest during those first years? Even when you are doing everything right, that question has a specific answer. It comes down to a pattern called the 8-4-3 rule. That is what this video is about. If you do not understand it, you will keep measuring your progress with a tool that is designed to discourage you. You will quit at exactly the wrong moment. My name is Alex, and if you have ever felt like the numbers should be moving faster by now, stay with this video, because the account is not broken. Your timeline is, and I am going to show you why the first 8 years are structurally the hardest, and how to track progress in a way that actually reflects reality. Once you understand how compounding builds in stages, you will stop second-guessing yourself during the slow part and start recognizing it for what it is. The pattern that explains all of this traces back to one simple map, and once you see the numbers laid out in sequence, the silence of those early years stops feeling like failure. Most people think compounding is slow because they are not investing enough, so they stress about contribution amounts, they obsess over which fund to pick, and they wonder if they should be doing something different. And almost none of that is the actual problem. The problem is the shape of compounding. It does not grow in a straight line. It grows in a curve, and the curve starts nearly flat before it bends sharply upward. If you do not know that going in, the flat part feels like proof that the whole thing is not working. Here is a way to think about it. Imagine you are rolling a snowball down a hill. In the first few seconds, it picks up barely anything. The snow sticks, but the ball is so small that each rotation adds almost nothing visible. Then, at some point, the size of the ball starts working for it. Each rotation now covers more surface area. The additions get bigger. The ball starts to look like it is growing on its own. Nothing changed about the hill. Nothing changed about the snow. What changed was the mass behind the rotation. That is the geometry of compounding. And the 8-4-3 rule is just a way of reading that geometry clearly. Here is how the numbers actually break down. Assuming a 7% average annual return, which is roughly the inflation-adjusted historical average of the US stock market, and assuming you are contributing around $500 a month, it takes approximately 8 years to reach your first $100,000. 8 years of consistent deposits, and you cross that line with your balance sitting somewhere around $102,000. That first stretch is the hardest. Your contributions are doing most of the work. The growth is real, but it is quiet. Then something shifts. That second $100,000 takes only about 4 years. Not 8, 4. You did not double your contributions. You did not find a better investment. The money you already accumulated started pulling more weight. By the time you are sitting at around $200,000, your existing balance is generating returns that noticeably accelerate the climb. The third $100,000 takes roughly 3 years. Same contributions, same fund, same 7%. But now you're adding $100,000 to your net worth every 3 years, almost on schedule. The math did not change, the scale did. Now let me give you a concrete example of what this looks like for a real person. A woman I know manages a small dental office in Phoenix, Arizona. She is 31 years old, earns around $68,000 a year, and started putting away $480 a month into a broad index fund at age 26. By the time she hit month 11, her balance was just under $6,000. She told me it felt like throwing money into a jar she could not see. Nothing felt different about her life. Nothing felt like progress. What she did not have was the map. She did not know that at month 11 she was supposed to feel exactly that way. She was not behind. She was not doing it wrong. She was just in the flat part of the curve, where the snowball is still too small for each rotation to show up visibly. Here is what the map would have told her. And if she stays consistent from age 26 to age 65, Her projected balance at retirement is approximately $1.3 million. She will have contributed around $220,000 out of her own pocket. The remaining $1,080,000 comes entirely from compounding. She does not earn that. She does not manage it. She just does not quit. But here is the part that matters for right now. Of that $1.3 million, roughly 60% of it accumulates in the last 12 years of the journey. Not the first 12, the last 12. The heavy lifting happens at the end, and the end only arrives if she survives the beginning. That is why the first 8 years feel so unrewarding. They are not designed to feel rewarding. They are designed to build the mass that makes everything after them possible. You are not watching growth during that phase. You are building the conditions for growth. Those are completely different activities, and confusing them is exactly what causes people to walk away. Now, you are probably thinking, that is fine in theory. But how do you actually stay in it when the scoreboard keeps telling you nothing is happening? That is where most of the advice breaks down. People are told to be patient, as if patience is just a personality trait you either have or do not. It is not. Patience in investing is a system. It is something you build deliberately, and it requires completely rethinking what you measure and why. And that brings us to the unbreakable engine, which is less about willpower than most people expect, and more about removing the conditions that make quitting feel rational in the first place. Willpower is a terrible investment strategy, not because people lack it, but because it depletes. Every time the market drops and you have to consciously talk yourself out of selling, you are spending a resource that runs out. And the early years of compounding are basically a long sequence of moments designed to drain that resource completely. So the question is not how to want it more. The question is how to build something that does not require wanting it every single day. Think about how autopilot actually works on a commercial flight. The pilot does not sit there manually holding the plane steady for 6 hours. The system holds it. The pilot's job is to set the parameters correctly at the start and intervene only when something genuinely goes wrong. Most people approach investing like they need to hold the controls the entire time. They check the account constantly. They react to every dip. They treat every piece of financial news as something that requires a response. And all of that active attention is not helping. It is creating the conditions for a bad decision. The goal of the foundation phase is to build a system so automatic that quitting becomes structurally harder than continuing. Not emotionally harder, structurally harder. That distinction matters. Let me give you a concrete example of what this looks like in practice. A guy I know drives long-haul freight routes out of Memphis, Tennessee. He is 34 years old, earns around $52,000 a year, and spent the first 2 years of his investing journey doing it manually. Every payday, he would transfer money into his brokerage account himself. Some months, he did it immediately. And other months, something came up. A repair bill, a slow week, a moment where the market looked ugly, and he told himself he would wait until things settled. He was not undisciplined. He was just using a system that had too many decision points built into it, and every decision point is an opportunity to talk yourself out of it. Then he changed one thing. He set up an automatic transfer for the day after his paycheck cleared. $40 every 2 weeks. Not a dramatic number, but it was now happening whether he thought about it or not. Within 8 months, he had stopped checking the account more than once a month. The anxiety dropped, not because his balance suddenly looked impressive, but because the decision was no longer his to make each cycle. That is the first layer of the engine. Remove the decision. Automate the contribution so it never competes with anything else in your budget. When the money moves before you see it, it stops feeling like a sacrifice and starts feeling like a fixed cost, the same way rent does. The second layer is changing what you measure. This is the part that most people skip, and it is probably the most psychologically powerful shift in the whole system. Dollar value is a terrible scoreboard during the early years. It swings with the market. It drops when sentiment drops. It gives you no information about whether you're actually making progress, because in a down market, someone who is accumulating shares rapidly looks identical to someone who is losing ground. The number goes down either way. Shares do not behave like that. Shares only accumulate. When the market drops, your fixed contribution buys more of them. When the market rises, the ones you already own are worth more. In both directions, the share count either holds or grows. Tracking shares instead of dollars turns a market dip from a loss into a buying event. The psychological experience of investing changes completely. The guy from Memphis started writing his share count on a sticky note inside his truck's sun visor. Not his balance, just the number of shares. Every 2 weeks, that number went up. Some weeks by a little, some weeks by more when prices were lower. But it only ever moved in one direction. That single change, tracking the right number, gave him a scoreboard that told the truth about his progress instead of lying about it. The third layer is making emotional decisions feel expensive. And this is where an accountability structure comes in. He made an agreement with his brother. If he ever sold any position out of panic rather than genuine financial need, he owed his brother $60 in cash, handed over in person. Not a fine he paid to himself, not a rule he kept privately. A real social cost with a real person attached to it. $60 is not a fortune, but the act of physically handing money to someone because you panicked is embarrassing in a way that sticks. He never paid it, not once in 3 years. And he said later that just knowing the rule existed was enough to create a pause between the impulse and the action. That pause is all you need. Most panic selling happens in the gap between a feeling and a decision. Close that gap with structure, not willpower. Trigger, scoreboard, accountability. 3 layers. And none of them requires discipline in the traditional sense. They require design. And here is what that design is actually building toward. Because surviving the early years is only half the equation. The other half is understanding what happens when the dynamic between you and your money fundamentally shifts, when you stop being the engine and your portfolio quietly takes over the job. That moment, what investors sometimes call the job handoff, is closer than most people in the early years realize, and it changes everything about how the math feels. There is a moment in every long-term investment journey where the rules quietly change, not dramatically, not with any announcement. You do not log in one day and see a notification that says your money is now working harder than you are. It just starts happening, gradually, and then all at once. And most people miss it entirely because they are still watching the wrong number. This is the job handoff, and understanding when it happens and what it actually means is probably the most underappreciated idea in personal finance. Here's the clearest way to think about it. In the early years, you are the primary engine. Your contributions drive the growth. The returns are real, but they are small, relative to what you're putting in. And if you contribute $500 a month and your portfolio earns $300 that month in returns, you are still responsible for the majority of the progress. You are the worker. The money is the assistant. But that ratio does not stay fixed. As your balance grows, the returns it generates start to close the gap with your contributions. And at some point, they cross over. The growth from your existing portfolio exceeds what you're adding yourself. That is the handoff. From that point forward, your money is doing more of the lifting than you are. Let me put some actual numbers behind that. Say you are 30 years old, contributing $500 a month into a broad index fund returning 7% annually. In year 1, your contributions account for roughly 83% of your portfolio's total growth. The market is doing the other 17. By year 10, that split has shifted to around 60% contributions, 40% returns. By year 20, the roles have essentially reversed. Your portfolio is now generating more growth each year than you are contributing. And by year 30, when you are 60 years old, your contributions represent less than 15% of the annual growth. The other 85% is compounding, working on the mass you built during all those quiet early years. That is not a theory. That is just arithmetic applied to time. Now here is why this matters so much for someone in year 4 or year 6. Which is exactly where a lot of people reading this are sitting right now. Quitting at year 5 feels rational. The balance does not look life-changing. The contributions feel large relative to what the account is generating. The scoreboard still looks discouraging. But year 5 is not the middle of the journey in terms of effort. It is almost the end of the hard part. The handoff, for most people contributing consistently at that level, happens somewhere between year 8 and year 12. Walking away at year 5 means doing all of the difficult, unrewarding groundwork and then leaving before the dynamic shifts in your favor. It is the equivalent of digging a well for 4 years, stopping when you are 20 feet from water, and concluding that wells do not work. Let me give you a concrete example. A woman I know teaches high school chemistry in Raleigh, North Carolina. She started investing at 29, putting in $380 a month. By 34, she had around $31,000 saved. It did not feel like much. She was contributing roughly $4,500 a year, and the account was growing by maybe $4,000 in a good year. She told me she felt like she was running to stand still. She stayed in. At 41, her balance crossed $180,000. Her contributions that year totaled $4,500, the same as always. but her portfolio generated just over $12,000 in returns that year. Her money was now contributing 2.5 times more to her net worth than she was. The handoff had happened quietly, somewhere around year 9, and she had not even noticed because she was not tracking that ratio. That shift changes everything about how investing feels. It is the difference between pushing the car and riding in it. The effort is the same, the contribution amount never changed, but the experience is completely different because the physics have changed. Here is what I think people get wrong about this. They treat the handoff as a reward for patience, something that happens to you if you wait long enough. But it is not a reward. It is a mathematical inevitability. If you stay in, it will happen. The only way it does not happen is if you leave before it does. And the cruel irony is that most people leave during the exact window when the handoff is closest. The account looks the same at year 5 as it did at year 2. A little bigger, but not transformatively so. And that visual similarity makes it easy to conclude that nothing has changed. But underneath the surface, the ratio is shifting. The mass is building. The geometry of the curve is beginning to bend. Knowing that does not make the waiting effortless, but it changes what the waiting means. You are no longer just being patient. You are holding your position while a structural change builds beneath you, which raises a practical question. Once you understand the shape of this journey, how do you actually structure your behavior to match it? Because the right mental model is only half the answer. The other half is a set of concrete daily habits that keep you in the game long enough for the job handoff to arrive. That is exactly what the starter kit is designed to do. Most investing advice skips straight to the what and ignores the how. Buy this fund, set this amount, think long term, and then it leaves you alone with a login screen and an account that looks identical 6 months later. What is not the hard part? The how is. Specifically, how do you build a daily reality that keeps you invested through 8 years of silence without relying on motivation you do not always have? That is what the starter kit is actually solving for, not a strategy, structure. And the place to start is not with a number. It is with a trigger. A trigger is something you already do every single day without thinking about it, not something you intend to do, something that already happens automatically, like making coffee, unlocking your phone in the morning, or clocking out at the end of a shift. The goal is to attach your investing habit to an existing behavior, so it stops living in the category of things you have to remember and starts living in the category of things that just happen. Here is why this matters more than it sounds. Research consistently shows that habits attached to existing routines are significantly more likely to stick than habits scheduled in isolation. You are not building a new behavior from scratch. You are borrowing the momentum of one that already runs on autopilot. A guy I know works as a paramedic in Austin, Texas. He earns around $61,000 a year and spent the better part of his late 20s telling himself he would start investing when things settled down. Things did not settle down. They never do. When he finally started, he tied his investment check into something he already did at the end of every shift, taking off his boots and sitting down for 10 minutes before driving home. That was the trigger. Every time he did it, he opened his brokerage app, confirmed his automatic transfer had processed, and logged his share count. The whole thing took 90 seconds, but it was now connected to something physical and repeatable, which meant it actually happened. The second step is picking the right investment vehicle, and this is where a lot of people overthink it badly enough to stall entirely. They spend weeks comparing funds, reading about expense ratios, worrying about whether they have the right mix. Meanwhile, the account sits empty. Here is the honest answer for someone in the early years: a broad, low-cost index fund that tracks the total US. Our stock market, or the S&P 500, is almost certainly the right starting point. The average expense ratio on these funds in 2026 sits around 3 to 0.04% annually. That means on a $10,000 balance, you are paying somewhere between $3 and $4 a year in fees. It is negligible. What is not negligible is the cost of waiting while you try to optimize something that does not need optimizing yet. Think of it this way. A playlist works because it contains a lot of good music, not because every single track is the best song ever recorded. A broad index fund works the same way. You're not picking the one winner. You're buying a share of the whole game. The paramedic in Austin put everything into a single total market index fund. No rotation strategy, no sector bets, just consistent contributions into one straightforward vehicle. 3 years in, his balance crossed $47,000. He had contributed just over $32,000 himself. The rest was growth. Simple works. The third step is tracking shares, not dollars. This one has already come up, but it is worth being specific about the mechanics. Write the number of shares you own somewhere physical. A sticky note, a small notebook, a note on your phone that you actually open, whatever format you will actually use. Update it every time a contribution is processed. The number should only ever go up. In a down market, your fixed contribution buys more shares, so the count rises faster. In an up market, your existing shares are worth more, so the dollar value climbs. Either way, the share count tells you a true story about accumulation. The dollar value tells you a story about sentiment. One of those is useful during the early years. The other one will talk you into quitting. The fourth step is the commitment, and this one is not about motivation. It is about pre-deciding. Tell yourself explicitly, before the hard moments arrive, that the first 8 years are supposed to feel exactly like this. Slow, unremarkable, occasionally discouraging. That is not a malfunction. That is the design. The flat part of the curve is load-bearing. It is where the mass accumulates that makes everything after it possible. Pre-deciding means that when month 14 looks identical to month 3, you already have an answer prepared. You are not behind. You are building. Trigger, fun, scoreboard, commitment, 4 steps. None of them requires a finance degree. None of them requires a high income. The paramedic in Austin started with $200 a month. What they require is a structure that removes the daily decision of whether to continue, because that decision, made repeatedly over 8 years, is where most people eventually get it wrong. And once that structure is in place, once the engine is running and the share count is climbing and the job handoff is quietly approaching, the only thing left is understanding the full shape of what you have built. Here's what this all comes down to. Compounding does not fail people. The scoreboard fails them. When you measure early progress in dollars, you are using a tool that is structurally designed to discourage you during the exact phase that matters most. The account looks broken. It is not. The curve is just flat before it bends. A few things are worth carrying forward. Growth and accumulation are not the same activity. The job handoff is a mathematical certainty, not a reward. And quitting in year 5 is not giving up early. It is giving up late, after doing all the hard work and just before the dynamic shifts. Watch for the moment when your portfolio's annual returns start closing in on your annual contributions. That ratio is the real scoreboard. When those two numbers approach each other, you're near the handoff. Mom, there is a question this naturally raises, and it is worth sitting with. If compounding builds this kind of momentum over time, what happens when you introduce additional income streams into the same system? What does the curve look like when the contributions themselves start growing? If that question is already forming in your mind, stay subscribed. That is exactly where this is heading.